Yesterday at our house already, so we're excited. If you have a Bible, why don't you turn to Jeremiah chapter 29. For some of you, you're going to turn here and you're going to realize that this page in your Bible, if you have a physical Bible in front of you, it is well worn. You might it opens right to it. You might have some things in the margin. So we're going to look at a verse today that is very well known. When I opened it in my YouVersion Bible app, the verse was already highlighted. So whether you have a physical Bible, digital Bible, you may have the same experience. If you Google this phrase, at least I did, and I know we're all subject to algorithms, whatever. But if you Google this phrase, Bible verse about God's plan for my life, very high probability you will be sent to this verse right here. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Who has heard this verse before? Real quick. Most of us have heard this. We're familiar. I'm reading it and you go, yeah, that sounds like something I'm familiar with. I imagine that, I won't have you put your hands up for this, but I imagine some of us have this hanging somewhere in our home. You may have a tattoo referencing this verse. You may have a bumper sticker, a coffee mug, something in your life that this verse has been significant. And you're like, that's a good reminder. And there absolutely is personal application here. It's important for us to know. And I, for the record, believe that God has a plan for each of our lives, that he has plans for us to prosper us, not to harm us, plans that involve a hope in a future. But I don't have that hope only because of this verse, because this passage not only was not written to us, it wasn't written to us. This was written years and years and years ago. We were not around. This verse was not written to us. It was not written about us, but I do believe it was written for us. We can benefit from this. So there absolutely is a personal component to this, the truth being presented here. I believe that. And then it's backed up through the greater scope of Scripture is where we find background for that. But this verse alone is not the only place where we find this truth represented. But it's important for us to realize that although this verse, when we read it, I know the plans I have for you. When you read that, the you, who do you think of? You think of me, or you think of me. No, say it, you think of you, I think of me. You know what I'm talking about. None of you are thinking of me, when you read this verse. You're thinking of you, me. But it is not just a personal verse. The scope of God's love cannot be so limited. It is for us. God does love us, but it's not limited at that. And if we use this verse and utilize this verse primarily as a teaching tool to remind and encourage ourselves how much God loves us, God loves me, God has a plan for me and for you, we miss that God's love is in fact so expansive that he has equal love for those around us. So today, with this verse in mind, we're going to do a very brief series. We're going to reuse a title that we've used in the past called Neighboring 101. And this is going to be a foundational message. If you were here for us, I think it was 2023, but this is not a theme that I rarely preach on. It's very, very important to our identity as Christ followers. But Neighboring 101, and my premise for this couple weeks is this. God's plan to bless you is often found within his plans for you to bless others. Let me say that again. Slowly, I want you to hear this. God's plan to bless you. This is Jeremiah 29:11. God has plans for you. God's plan to bless you is often found within his plan for you to bless others. Jeremiah 29:11 is true. Jeremiah 29:11 is a powerful reminder of the God that we serve and how he views his people. But as always, context is key. And the context of Jeremiah 29 is a historical event, not just a biblical event, because there are biblical events that are debated in history. This is a historical event mentioned in Scripture. So whether you consider the biblical account or an abiblical historical account, you will find an event that took place called the Babylonian captivity or the exile. The Babylonian captivity was a historical event, something that we can learn about. Any history buffs in here? You enjoy history? I really do. I'm fascinated by history, national history, international, like where did we come from? How did we wind up where we are today? I love my favorite class that I took in college was church history. Where did we come from? How did we get here? I love it. And you can learn about history and historical events in at least two ways. The first is to approach it with an academic, intellectual perspective. Think textbooks. If you wanted to learn about something like the Civil War, I had to write this down, I think this is pretty accurate, 1861 to 1865-ish, right? And if you want to learn, I imagine there's some of you in here who know a great degree about the Civil War. Although none of us were there, you may know a lot because you've read and you've listened and you've watched Ken Burns and you enjoy soaking this kind of stuff up. And that's good. And you can learn the intellectual academic background. You can learn why the war was fought and how it developed. And, there's these political conflicts that are stewing and being stirred up, and then they overflow into this rebellion and what's going to happen. And now we're taking sides, and you can learn about dates, and you can learn about death counts and casualties. You can learn about which soldier did this and which hero did this and which person was struck down early and all of these things. Academic, intellectual pursuit of learning about the Civil War. The second way that we can learn about a historical event like the Civil War, and I'm going to show us also the Babylonian captivity, is not academic and intellectual, but it is personal and relational. Personal and relational. So in 1861, on July 14th, there was a major named Sullivan Bellow, and Sullivan Bellow wrote a letter to his wife. This is on the front end of the war. Maybe you've seen accounts like this before where someone from the front lines writes a letter home, or someone from home writes a letter to a soldier, and these have been preserved for us for years, and we can learn about the war. But guess what we don't learn about in these letters, generally speaking? We don't learn about the exact path, war path that different groups took. We don't learn about the death count exactly here or there. We don't learn about the numbers. We learn instead about the personal toll that war took on people. And on July 14th in Camp Clark in Washington, D.C., Major Sullivan Bellow wrote a letter now known as "To My Dear Wife." And in it, he writes this. This is just an excerpt. Let me read this. "If I do not return, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, nor that when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name." He was killed 1 week later by a bullet in the war. What does that teach us about the war, about Civil War? That gives you a new perspective, right? That we can have the classroom conversation. We learn about the dates and how many dead and what weapons were used and the military tactics. Or we can read a letter sent by a husband who was terrified that he would never see his wife again. And he was right. And he wanted to articulate what was going on here so that she could have a grasp of what was happening in the war. If we only have textbooks, we miss the heart. We miss the human toll of things like war. And if we only have letters and we have no textbooks, then we have no context for the details that matter. We need both, right? Now think of that in relationship to this Babylonian captivity, a historical event. The Bible for us actually provides both accounts, the historical, intellectual, as well as the personal and relational. So we're in Jeremiah. The context of Jeremiah is that there was a man named Jeremiah. He's a prophet, and he's writing and proclaiming a message to God's people. But what is going on outside is that there is a historical context to be mindful of. And we have multiple accounts, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. They are historical narratives. They're giving us details. We have others like Jeremiah who's writing a little bit differently, okay? So I want to paint for a picture where both of those things come together today. If you get on, if you have an NIV Bible like I do, the section that I'm about to read in 2nd Chronicles 36, and you can keep your finger in Jeremiah if you'd like, put this on the screen. Mine is titled The Fall of Jerusalem. That's the kind of name you give a significant moment. Think of words like Appomattox, Gettysburg. For those history buffs, like there's words and places that take us to a different place if you know the story. The fall of Jerusalem would be one of those loaded phrases as well. Here in 2nd Chronicles, we read the historical side, intellectual side, academic side of the fall of Jerusalem. Let me read this. He, referring to God, brought up against them, his people, the king of the Babylonians. Pause real quick. The king of the Babylonians, his name was Nebuchadnezzar. He was the enemy. And it says, God brought up against them, his people, the king of the Babylonians. So here's what the king did. The king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary. And he did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and they broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and they destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. There we have an academic, intellectual, historical account of what was going on. And if you go look it up on Wikipedia or Britannica online, you'll find something that mirrors this account. It's not just the Bible. You can find this in history completely separate from the scriptures. Another account that says kind of part of the fall, the exile moment, is in 2 Kings 25. And at the end of this, it sums it up real succinctly. So Judah, which is another name for Israel, God's people, and this part of it, says, so Judah went into captivity away from her land. Now Jerusalem, Judah, living in the city of Jerusalem, was much more than just a city. It was a city that had been established by the very will of God. Those of you who've been with us for a while ago, we went through the book of Exodus, and you know the journey that the Hebrew people took, that God led them through out of slavery in Egypt and through a desert and through times of trials and many miraculous moments to the point where they get to what was known as the promised land. And we can fast forward again through different battles, moving through the promised land, and God brings them, and years later, he establishes them in this city known as Jerusalem or Zion, and now they're living in the city that God has established. It wasn't just about national borders and national presence, but it was about their religious identity. It was significant historically, politically, and religiously. And this is the city that was attacked by a pagan nation, a nation that did not respect, know, or worship the Lord their God. And not only did they attack the city, they desecrated the temple. The wall was destroyed and people were killed indiscriminately. So that's the historical side, right? That's the what happened, okay? But now let me show you a little bit about what the experience was like. The Bible provides that for us as well. The book of Lamentations, this entire book, to lament is to grieve or to cry. It's a good thing, and it's a lost practice, generally speaking, in the church today, that we don't spend, there's not a lot of downer Sundays, right, where we just come together and cry about injustice. There probably should be, but we don't. And yet we have this entire book. We don't know exactly who wrote it. Tradition says Jeremiah. And the book begins not with a generic account about how when things are bad, this and that. but a very specific account, a first-person perspective, poetically articulating what it was like for the exiles, for those who had watched their countrymen, their family members, their priests, and their elders be murdered, be killed indiscriminately, then taken out of their city and kept in captivity in Babylon. And now in Lamentations, we're writing not a historical account, but a personal articulation of what this felt like. Let me read this to you. The book begins, and I'll jump from the first 3 verses to verse 16 to verse 19. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, but finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. I called to my allies, but they betrayed me. My priests and my elders perished in the city while they searched for food and kept themselves alive. That's different than a historical account, right? The first account from Chronicles and from Kings is this specific king, Nebuchadnezzar, came into the city. He killed these people. He took these things. And you can go read that entire chapter in 2 Chronicles 36, and it goes into great detail. He stole these things. The wall was broken down by this. This was set fire to. It's like that history book that wants to give you every bit of pertinent information about the battle. Lamentations, though, is about the personal perspective, about weeping. Immediately there's it says how like a widow she is. You would never find that in a history book. They're trying to be precise. And here, likely Jeremiah is trying to move the reader to understand what it was like. Think about how they felt having had their city on a hill destroyed, having watched their friends, family members, priests, elders, young men and young women with no particular rhyme or reason, all killed by King Nebuchadnezzar's army. The infirm, infants, how would they feel? What response would they have? History books can't tell us this exactly, but the personal side can. Psalm 137, the book of Psalms, the author writes from the perspective, again, of someone in the exile, someone that went through that lived through it graciously, luckily, by the providence of God, not killed by the sword as thousands of others are dead. This person gets brought through to the exile. And here we read in a relatively well-known passage. This is actually, I remember this being included in my English class in high school at Carroll. It's not a Christian school, obviously, but there's a poetic linguistic significance to Psalm 137 because it ties into history. Here's what we read about, not just how the exiles may have felt, but what they wanted to do. What was the response they were looking for? By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. I wish I could tell you that last line was allegory, right? I wish I could tell you, oh, no, that's very graphic, but don't be offended. They just meant they were mad. I don't think that's what the author is trying to say. And this is a good reminder for us. Not only is context important, but genre is important. Just because something is in the Bible does not make it Christ-like. You know that? You can't just turn to things because that's a horrific verse. That's actually a horrific prayer. And essentially what the Psalms are songs and prayers. Can you imagine praying that? Can you imagine praying to God and expressing so much desire for retribution and revenge that you say, happy would be the one who would seize my enemies' infants and dash them against rocks? The visual here is horrible, church. I'm trying to let you see this. And I'm not going to describe the implications of this verse because it's so graphic, it's disturbing. And this is the psalmist. This is Psalms. This is happy. This is the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Like, what is going on here? Out of context, this verse, I think, is scary. It's troubling. It should be. But in the context of what Babylon had done, I think it's very, very, very human. And I think that's what we see here is a human response to someone having done a horrible thing. So, back to us. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who has survived the exile. How would you feel? How would you feel if you had watched an invading nation come in and indiscriminately kill your countrymen, specifically targeting your houses of worship, your church, not giving any consideration to age, but killing the old and the young, killing the elderly, killing infants, going out of the way to kill priests and religious elders? How would you feel, and how would you, if we're being honest, how would you want to respond if you survived that? And now you're in captivity in this country. You're essentially a slave, and you're going to be there, and you can read this in Jeremiah 29:10. You're going to be there for 70 years. This isn't like a quick rescue, This isn't a nice 2-hour movie. This isn't going to happen. This is your new reality for generations. How would you want to respond? There are those of us in this room, I think, we can actually relate to this in at least one way, and I'm sure others as well. So let me kind of change the tone a little bit and ask you this. If I asked you, where were you on a specific date? If I ask, where were you on July 22nd, 1984? Can anyone tell me where you were on July 22nd, 1984? Can you really? You got a significant, we had 2 people in the first, anybody else? Maybe? Okay, we had 2 people in the first service. One of them shocked me, one of them didn't. The one that didn't shock me was my mother, because that's my birthday. Now, I bet you guys, you remember that date for a different reason, and I want to hear it later. I'm guessing, unless you were aware that, ta-da, big day for me. I know where I was, my mom knows where she was, my dad knows where he was. Most of you don't know where you were on July 22nd, 1984, if you were even alive. But if I asked you instead, where were you on September 11th, 2001, show of hands, who knows where you were, what you were doing? Most of us. Significant dates, okay? I was at Carroll High School. In mid-morning, we walked in, and one of the teachers turned on the TV. And you walk in thinking, oh, that's cool, what's going on? The TV's never on. And then we realized something very scary was happening. And throughout the rest of that day, for us, it simply meant going into a class and looking at the TV in the corner and no one really knowing what's happening. The bell would ring. We'd go to our next class. The TV would be on. We'd watch it in the corner. And if you were the age that you can remember what was going on in that day, maybe you remember just the feelings kind of progressing throughout the day. But on 9/11, obviously, New York City was attacked. The final death toll was just under 3,000, 2,977 deaths. The youngest recorded was 2. The oldest was 82. 77 nationalities. The lives of 77 people representing different nationalities were included in that. And there were 441 first responders killed. Talk about indiscriminate killing and death. How did you feel watching that day unfold? If you were like many people, you began by being very unsure, confused, and worried, right? One plane had hit a tower and what? Like, we couldn't comprehend, does not compute. And then we're watching, and then a second plane hits another tower, and worry might transition into fear. And then later, as you start thinking about what's going on, for many people, fear grew to anger. And in the days and weeks that came after that, anger was not enough, but there was a desire for vengeance that came out of that. We were told, never forget. And I think that's a good thing. Now, I'm preaching this message today in November, not September, and that's because that's not the point of this message. But when we say never forget, the first thing we want to never forget is those who were lost, obviously. I imagine in a room this size, you probably have connections, one or two people removed, who were there firsthand, who suffered a loss, who were more connected than others. So we never forget those who were lost, but I also believe an intended or unintended consequence of that phrase also means that we never forget those who perpetrated it. Even if we don't know exactly who they were, we have our guesses, and we did as a country in the weeks that followed. The month after, in October, we launched into Operation Enduring Freedom. And we militaristically attacked those we believed responsible, because you don't do that to us. You don't attack a city, and not just any city. This was not a random city. This was a city that shows our the strength, our financial impact, the importance of the towers. This is a city that people would come into, and we have Ellis Island. It's symbolically important. It's religiously important, meaning people came in of many faiths and could practice those faiths, right? So it was intentional that enemies who did not like the way of life here attacked indiscriminately and killed with a broad intentionality, making a statement for their beliefs. And when we attacked back, somewhere between, I had to look this up, it's a wide range, nobody knows for sure, but 1,300 to 8,000 deaths directly related to Operation Enduring Freedom in the Middle East and Afghanistan, primarily. We lost about 3,000 people that day, and there are implications for those who got sick later, things like that. But in the immediate attacks afterwards, somewhere between 1,000 and 8,000 people directly dead. But in the years that followed, months and years, up to 20,000 dead. Many, possibly most, civilians. So within that group of people, surely there were infants. There were elderly. There were those that were young. There were those that were old. There were the infirm. There were grandparents and moms and dads and first-time parents and newlyweds. Same thing that happened in the Twin Towers, every walk of life. And when I think about this battle back and forth, I think about my thoughts. I was so angry as a high school kid. And when you're in high school, man, you're never more idealistic and ready to just, you take on things differently. And I felt personally attacked. You know, I hadn't been in New York, but like, I was angry and I was excited to see bombs fall, if I can be honest. And I repent of that, have repented of that since. That's not the attitude that I want in my heart, but that was my honest response, and perhaps some of you as well. And in that moment, Psalm 137:9 made a lot of sense to me. I want the worst possible thing against the type of evil people who would do this to our country. So how do we go? Here's what I'm wondering. Now, here's why I say all this. How do we go from Psalm 137:9, the people in exile, experiencing life on the other side of this captivity, how do we go from wishing infants of our enemies to be killed to the most popular encouragement of personal blessing? Jeremiah 29:11. How in the world do we make that jump from I want my enemies' kids to pay to God's got a plan for my life and I'm going to put it on a coffee mug? Right? How do we make that jump? Here's why. It's the premise of this whole message. God's plan to bless you is often found within his plan for you to bless others. It all comes back to this. I mean it. Let me show you this. Here's Jeremiah 29, verse 4-7. And you can't get to verse 11 unless you read 4-7, right? We can't just parachute in and say 11. That's my verse. Nah, this other stuff, I don't want it. If you find Jeremiah 29:11 encouraging, uplifting, reminding you of God's purpose for your life, you have to be ready to read this as well. And it says this. The prophet Jeremiah says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses, settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry, have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, do not decrease. And here's the kicker. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, so you too will prosper. Think about your feelings, your emotions in the days after 9/11 and maybe your desire, like mine, for blood, eye for eye. And imagine the people who are sitting in exile with visceral memories of watching their loved ones put to death, old and young alike. Priests, religious leaders, families dead. And now they're sitting in a country they're not their own, being held captive in slavery, and they're going to be there for the next 70 years. What kind of feelings do you have towards your captors? What kind of feelings do you have towards those who are responsible for this? And then God, through the prophet Jeremiah, tells you, hey, while you're there, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Would anybody else have a problem with that? God, did you miss all of our history? Pray for who? Do you know why we're here? Of course he knows why they're there. This was not outside of his purview. He knew what was happening. But what we find here in verse 11, this blessing for me and for you and for those who put our hope in God, that he's got a plan for us. What we find in this blessing, we find at the end of an unexpected road, the road of us seeking to bless others, even or especially those who don't deserve it. Seek the peace and prosperity. Pray to the Lord. You can take two routes. All of us have this choice. You can go the Psalm 137:9 response, dash the infants against the rocks. That's the natural response. You'd be human if you choose that. And yet we also have the invitation of Jeremiah 29:7, which is to pray for the peace and the prosperity of those responsible for even the most heinous crimes. That's supernatural. We can't do that on our own. Church, let me say this. As God's people, we are called to reject the old way of living, the manner of eye for eye. We are called to reject this vilification of those who are different than us, the neighbors, whether they're neutral, good, or evil. God, we're called to reject those classifications altogether and instead simply run toward trouble wherever we see it. Why? Because the world's a very dark place, and we have been given light. We've been given the light of Christ. In John 17:18, Jesus says, as you have sent me into the world, he's praying this. He says, God, as you have sent me into this world, I am sending them into the world. We've been sent to run like first responders ourselves. We are meant to run towards evil. It doesn't mean send our kids into evil places and, well, good luck, we'll see what happens. No, but as mature believers, we have something the world desperately needs. And we know that God so loved the city of Kendallville, or at least the good people in it, or at least the good people who think like me. No. God loved who? The world. And if God can love and pursue a sinful, rebellious world, pursuing them with love and light and inviting them into what is good, shouldn't we at least attempt to do the same? What does this have to do with our neighbors? Because I want us as a principle and a foundation to know that we have to view neighbors differently than the world would tell us to view neighbors. Much of what the world would say is that neighbors are different. Neighbors, they can do their own thing. If they have, just leave them be. Just kind of look out for yourself. And you know what? Take that 29:11 verse and go, God, it's got a plan for you, and huddle up with people like you and pursue that. And yet what we learn here is that God has a different plan for his people, that our neighbors would have no borders, and that even if, and this is the big one, even if people would consider me or you an enemy, we don't return that classification. Enemies only exist if both parties, two to tango, right? Is that what, or tango? I'm not sure if it's dancing or fighting. But if you call me an enemy, but I don't agree towards you, deal not brokered. As Christians, we don't have enemies. Pastor Brian Zand puts it this way. He says, what is an enemy? Someone whose story you have not yet heard. And I believe this is true. There is a foundational countercultural belief, church, that the world, that we have to understand this. The world is not primarily made of enemies to defeat, but neighbors to whom we've been called to show the love and the light of Christ. There are people who call you enemy, but it's your choice and mine whether or not we return that classification. We're going to close in a song today called More Like Jesus. And while the band comes up, I want to tell you about an implication of this series, this very, very brief series, just 2 weeks. 2 weeks we're going to talk about this. Is on December 7th, we're going to have Love in Action Sunday. And some of you who have been with us for a couple years know what this is. On this day, we'll go out, we'll gather here like normal for 9 and 11 worship services, but then after that, we'll only sing about one song. In Scout's honor, I'll probably only preach 5 minutes, maybe 10, 15 or 20, but I will shoot for 5. And then what we'll do, though, is we're going to go out, and we're going to go to Walmart, we're going to give you a list, and we're going to go buy groceries for people we don't know, people that are our neighbors. We know that in the recent, although it sounds like SNAP benefits are being returned or going to come through, and people are going to have the funds they thought they were going to have, like that's great, but it's been a kind of a chaotic time. And I know that includes people in our church community. And so we as a church want to make sure that as families and kids primarily go home for the holiday break, especially those who are on maybe free or subsidized lunches. If you need help with lunches during the school session, what do you do when kids go home? Do you not need help? Because when they're at home, they eat more. They eat constantly. And so we as a church want to make sure that we are blessing our neighbors. Why? Because we believe that neighbors are not to be defended against or defeated, but loved. That's the foundational. That's why we start with this passage. So we'll get more details coming up, but I want you to mark your calendars. And if you're like my family, like begin to budget and go, how can we afford to pay for other people's groceries when ours are tight and numbers are up? We're praying about it, and we're reorganizing our budget so we can do that very thing. I'm going to invite you to do the same. So we're going to sing this song called More Like Jesus. That's our prayer today, that there's a world dying to know who Jesus is, and we have the opportunity to help point them in that direction. Would you stand with us together as a church as we sing?